Hello, my friends. Welcome to another episode of Revolution 250 podcast. It's Revolution 250 is an organization dedicated to commemorating the events leading up to the Revolutionary War. I'm Bradley Jay, and our co-host is Robert Allison, history professor at Suffolk University and the chair of Revolution 250. And today's esteemed guest is Professor Serena Zabin of Carleton College. And we're going to talk about one of her many publications, the Boston Massacre, a family history. And one of the other things we'll get to is a video game that the professor created that is related to the revolution called Witness to the Revolution, I believe. So thank you very much for being with us, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
And Bob, thank you too. Bob, why don't you kick things off?
Thank you. Thank you, Bradley. And thank you, Serena, for joining us. Why don't you tell us a bit about the Boston Massacre, a family history, which really is a new take on this big event we all know all about.
Yeah, I mean, we did think that there was everything was known that needed to be known about the Boston Massacre. It seemed like a pretty straightforward story of a number of soldiers with guns who were possibly provoked by a number of Bostonians, primarily young men in the street, and ended up shooting them. 5 of them died eventually, and a number more continued to be, suffer from the wounds the rest of their lives. And it seemed like a fairly straightforward story. And the story seems pretty straightforward, in fact, because it was told so vividly in one of the very, very few images we actually have from 18th century North America, which is Paul Revere's very famous engraving of what he called the Bloody Massacre, which he really clearly indicates that the soldiers are the ones actually doing the shooting, that that they were told to shoot by first their officer, who's standing safely behind them, waving his sword and urging them on, shooting into this crowd of, kind of well-dressed Bostonians. And if there's any doubt about whose fault that shooting really is, Revere makes it clear by indicating that it's not even only the soldiers who are at fault, but actually the British government itself. And so that picture, it's so vivid. It's in every single textbook. It's all over kind of early American history, that it gets to be difficult to imagine that there's another story there. We know, of course, we know pretty clearly, we've always known that that picture is kind of a piece of propaganda because of the kind of overblown pieces that Revere added to it. But we never really thought about what else he was hiding. We just thought about what the story was he was trying to tell. So I got really interested in thinking about what else happened besides this one story that Revere and the Sons of Liberty have told us for 250 years.
What are some of the things that painting covered up?
So the most important thing
engraving,
engraving, exactly, sorry, that engraving covered up was actually the richness of the connections and the extent of the connections between soldiers and civilians. So if you go back and take a look at that picture, freely available in all kinds of places, the center of the picture itself is this kind of white line of gunsmoke, the gunsmoke that's coming out of the soldiers' guns. And it looks like it's really dividing on one side of the street, the soldiers, and civilians from the other side of the street. But in fact, both what happened that night and the longer story of civilian and military relationships in Boston show that there wasn't any line dividing one side from the other. Instead, soldiers and civilians really gotten to know each other very well in the 17 months that the soldiers had been living in Boston, that both the night of the shooting, there were civilians right up close to the soldiers, talking to them, asking them about their families, how things were going. They knew each other by first name, but also they were bound together with all kinds of other connections. Really, what happened that night, it was a conflict between neighbors and not between strangers.
So it's more like a brawl than a military action?
certainly wasn't a military action. And even a brawl might be a little formal for what really happened that night, I think.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, you found like 100 soldiers and their spouses who bring their babies to King's Chapel to be baptized in these 17 months. That's extraordinary.
Yes. So when the soldiers come to Boston, one of the things that we forget, I think, a lot about the 18th century army is that it's a family institution. That actually the British Army, and for that matter, the French Army too, traveled with families, with women and children. They pay some of them to come. They actually pay wages and rations, but they also pay for their transportation as they're moving them around the empire. And then more women and children come than are strictly allowed, strictly paid for. But in fact, hundreds of women and children end up in Boston in 1768 when the troops come. And then they continue to have children. And indeed, the soldiers who are not married marry a number. There's about 40, at least 40 marriages in the churches alone between local women and British soldiers that happened in that 17 months. I'm sure there are many, many more. Actually, that's a pretty conservative count. But then when they have children, they bring their kids to the local churches to be baptized. And they often ask locals as well as their kind of friends among the troops to act as godparents. So they create these fictive families, right? In the way that godparents do.
Was there any other motivation than just being with the family to come here? Was it considered a great posting, or was it not? And were there opportunities for women here that might not be in their homeland? Was it an exciting thing or a bummer?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So mostly North America is a bummer, right? People who are coming in, especially these troops who are coming either from Ireland, where they've been for quite a while and had families and were pretty settled, or indeed the 14th Regiment is actually coming from England itself. Most of them think of New England, and some of them go through Canada first, as a place with really wretched weather. And they're not happy about that. So in fact, when they're deployed to go, officers who can leave are like, I think I can't make it, right? I'd just as soon not go. So they're not happy about that, about coming at all, but they're really unhappy about their orders in Boston. So when soldiers during peacetime are, there's not really supposed to be a standing army. And so often the British government is trying to figure out what to do with this army. And they end up using them as a kind of peacekeeping force in ways, but really what they do is they use them a little bit as a police force. They use them to shut down smuggling and to shut down riots. And they do this all over England. They do it all over Ireland. And that's what the Massachusetts governor is expecting when he asks for troops to come to Massachusetts. And the administration understands that this is one use of soldiers, but actually officers, and I think maybe even privates, really dislike this part of their job because the likelihood is actually that there is going to be a shooting, right? It happens pretty frequently. It happened in London, not only a few months before. It happened in Ireland with some frequency. And often, actually, officers are found guilty. And they are really anxious. They are pretty sure that when they are sent to do urban policing, this is going to end their careers. And the captain on guard that night was, it was true. Like that was the end of his military career.
Bob?
So who were these guys, Serena, who are in the 14th and 29th regiments?
So they're a mix. They're a lot older than we imagine, right? Many of them are middle-aged and married with children. Many of them are more skilled than we think of. So officers have kind of famously complained that privates in the British Army were the sort of dregs of Britain, right? People that you just like scrape off the ground because they're too drunk to say no. But that's actually not at all what these people were like. About half of them seem to have been sufficiently literate to sign their names. We know from other studies of literacy that probably means that more of them could read even than could write. And many of them had some specialty. They were tailors or carpenters, so they had some skilled ability also. The Army, especially in a time of economic contraction, at least it offers a pretty regular set of wages, right? Not a lot and not as much as people would want, unsurprisingly, but but people mostly in peacetime did choose to join the Army. They're not drafted. It is a lifetime commitment, but it's also pretty easy to get out of. I mean, you can just ask, and most of the time they let you go.
Interesting. So,
question about the women.
Yes.
How did the women that came with the soldiers differ from the local women? They grew up at different places. Well, in many cases, were the local women here considered more or less wild, more or less reliable, smarter, not as smart, tougher, not as tough? How are they different?
Interesting question. I think they're not thought of as terribly different. I mean, the women who traveled with the Army were thought of by kind of, wealthy elite Bostonians, right, and other kind of political types. They also are thought of as like the dregs of the universe, right? They're thought of as just, pretty much women who are in it for the sex, right? Loose women who are, likely to lead a man astray. I think that's not at all what these women were. Most of them are women who are trying really hard to keep their families together. And that's primarily what they're doing there. They're working in this economy of makeshifts, just trying to make it all work for them. Boston women, I think, were seen as not that different. The divide between an English woman and a Massachusetts woman is not as big as the divide between a wealthy woman and a poor woman. That's the real distinction, I think.
Did any of the officers have their wives with them?
Some of the officers did bring wives. More of those women stayed home, largely because, as I said, New England seemed like such an unfortunate kind of place to go. But some of them do. They decide they want to stay with their husbands, and they do travel. They make some social life, both in Boston and in some of the other places that they're posted. And, they travel back and forth often. They have more ability to go home again than many of the privates because they pay for their own transport.
Can we talk a little bit about Witness to Revolution, the video game you and your students are creating?
Yeah, so Witness to the Revolution is a three-dimensional immersive computer game, very much under development, that grew out of the research for this book. So when I started trying to figure out the relationships between soldiers and civilians and started coming across these baptisms and marriage records in the churches, I wondered if soldiers and civilians had gotten to know each other because they were living together. As it happened, the soldiers, all the troops, end up living right in the heart of Boston, primarily because the Army rents spaces for them. Some warehouses that they turn into barracks, but very largely people's extra houses and spare rooms and basements and sheds and whatever. So soldiers are living all over Boston. And I thought, well, if I could plot where they're living and see where that is relative to the people that they're marrying or whose kids they're sponsoring, maybe I could figure out what those relationships were. So as I started plotting them everywhere, I realized that I was creating this pretty rich digital map. And I had some students working with me on it. And they started wondering what it was that people saw as they walked around Boston. And so pretty soon we started imagining, well, what would that map look like in 3 dimensions instead of that kind of bird's eye view that we think of with the map, right? What happens if you try to walk around the streets? Who would you run into? What do you see? And then when it comes to the night of the shooting itself, how much could you see? Which is a really interesting question.
Is it kind of like, Street View of Google Street View? Like
a little bit, right? Although we had to, hand build all of these buildings, right, by digitally, which becomes quite complicated, and honestly required a level of of physics knowledge that, surpassed me pretty quickly. So we brought in a colleague of mine who does digital humanities, and we came up with a pretty fun, what should I say, a pretty interesting game, what we were calling a serious game, in which the player interviews a number of people who gave depositions the day after the shooting to try to get some sense, what is it that they saw? And then the player has to try to put together some of this contradictory evidence that they end up getting. They make some choices about how many people they thought were there, how aggressive they thought the crowd was, kind of whose fault it was, maybe where the captain was standing. And then they saw a recreation of the shooting from that perspective. And it was, I would say, interesting and kind of earnest. And then my own children played it, as did a bunch of other kids. I'm like, this is not fun. Like, why do you think this is a game? It's not,
so how do you win?
Right, exactly. How do you win? Where are my health points?
You gotta win.
I know, I want to level up, right? There were all kinds of things. So, and I'm not a gamer, so I was like, okay. So we actually just this summer started a partnership with two fabulous scholars at the University of Wisconsin Stout, which has a very large game development program, and a number of their students. And we really have started rethinking the entire game. So at the moment, what we're imagining are a number of kind of almost episodes, right, that will be collected together in maybe what we would call a season, that are still organized around a single character, right, a single person who gave evidence, but is able to pull in more of the research from my book. So you get a little more sense of the richness of Boston itself, right? Each piece still sort of adds up to become a different picture of what people saw that night. But for example, we're working on one right now based on a woman named Jane Crothers, who ends up marrying a soldier about 3 weeks after the shooting, gives evidence in Captain Preston's trial. She was living at the Royal Exchange Tavern, I think probably working there. So one of the kind of tasks you have to do is, make flip, right? Which is a lot of fun because you stick a hot poker in it and it foams up.
What is flip?
So flip is a rum-based drink, right? That also has a little bit of citrus in it, some nutmeg, and as I said, also it has egg white, which then when you stick a poker or it actually has there's a more technical term that actually I can't totally remember right now, for the kind of hot iron that you stick in your drink and foam it up, it makes, a really impressive looking cocktail. So
it sounds like a very labor intensive drink.
It's a pretty labor intensive
Probably be pretty
drink.
Expensive.
Well, rum is not that expensive, right? And it's only little bits of the citrus of lemon or orange, whatever it is you've got there. So it's a bar drink, right? It's labor intensive, but it's not necessarily ingredient expensive. So one of the things you have to do is make some flip and deliver it. And then another thing that you have to do is actually try to get some of the some of the soldiers' clothing, especially stockings, but other parts of their wardrobe, shoes too, actually are very hot on the black market, right? Clothing is a very expensive commodity. In my first book, I talked a lot about what I call the informal economy, ways in which people pawn clothing as a way of expanding their currency. It's kind of illegal, but not completely illegal. It's a little hard to shut down. There's no real laws against it, right? So it has to get shut down in other ways. And we do know that in Boston, there is a black market in soldiers' clothing, which I write about a little bit. I'm not at all convinced Jane Crothers was a part of it, but we sort of are bringing that into the story. So she has to sort of dart around the tavern, avoiding officers while she's trying to pick up these stockings. And so she has you have a few quests that you have to do, which is
quests.
Satisfying to my 14-year-olds,
Wow.
right?
Great.
So you get something from that. And then she hears a voice, she goes out, she sees certain things. But that ends up being sort of much more as a cutscene, right? The
Right.
part that you do is an activity, a quest, and then you see what she saw.
See.
I'm looking forward to seeing this game when it gets
It's gonna be a lot of fun.
when it gets rolling.
We're excited
Yeah.
about it.
Sounds like you had a question, Bob.
I was just going to ask where you find all of these great stories and where do you do your research?
Yeah, so I did my research in all kinds of archives. So a lot of it comes from legal records, right? I spent a lot of time with the court records, and the court records show all kinds of things. So they certainly show things like theft and pieces like that. But also in Boston, one of the wonderful things about it is that the selectmen actually have a lot of anxiety about how much they're going to have to pay out in poor relief, right? In welfare. So they actually hire a guy to walk around and warn people who are not from Boston that they're not actually entitled to poor relief. And in fact, Cornelia Dayton and Sharon Salinger wrote a wonderful book about this.
Robert Love.
About Robert Love, right. And so Robert Love and some of the other people, but Love in particular, kept fabulous notes that he turned in that show up also in our legal records, of who he found in different places as he's walking around warning people that they're not entitled to poor relief. And so from those records, I figured out who is living where, how many people are living there, who else is in the house when he goes to talk to them. So lots of little tidbits like that. The most important piece really is are the records that I found in London, which are the muster rolls. So in order to figure out who's who, I really needed to know who is a soldier. After the officers and the privates were in Boston for a few months, actually the courts and the churches stopped identifying them really explicitly as soldiers, right? They might say instead of, John Adams of Boston, or I guess they wouldn't say that about Adams, but, Paul Revere of Boston, they might say something like, Ponsonby Molesworth, living in Boston. That's a little hint that this is not a permanent resident, but they didn't necessarily say Molesworth, of the 29th Regiment. So in order to know who was who, I actually had to make a big database figuring out who are all the 2,000 guys who were actually in Boston, and then cross-reference them against all of the other records from the 4 years or so that there are soldiers in Boston. So that's the heart of the research.
Did the integration of the soldiers into the community, particularly the unmarried soldiers who might date, if you will, or marry a local woman, did that cause a problem with getting the soldiers to be soldierly? It's going to be a lot harder to do your job as a soldier if you're almost in the family. You're expected to soldier, if you know what I mean.
Right. Yes, absolutely. So there's a couple of problems there, right? Like one is absolutely, there are concerns about something that might look like divided loyalty. And the British Army is always worried about that. So they never really want to keep troops in any place more than 3 years because they really don't want them to put down roots. The problem is it's expensive to move troops. It's a pain. You need to have ships to do it with. And so they have these plans that hardly ever work out. So, that's why the 29th Regiment was in Ireland for, I don't even know, 9 years or something, right? They leave troops in Minorca for 14, right? It's just too much of a pain to move them around. But they do worry that this might happen, right? That they're going to end up shooting or, trying to police their own people. They don't worry about it that much, though, not enough to do anything about it. But it is true that when soldiers end up marrying into local families, when they're supposed to leave, when they're redeployed, it really opens up some huge problems for them, right? What is going to happen? And in the end, I actually think that's maybe the most significant outcome of this whole shooting that comes to be known as the Boston Massacre, is that the troops end up being redeployed, right? One set rather quickly within a few months, one a few years later. But when that happens, basically people are faced with choices, right? Either the new wife, right, who's this Boston woman, can do something that we might call self-divorce, right? And stay home while the soldier leaves and create a new family. And there are women who absolutely do that. They remarry people that we know end up fighting in the Continental Army, or sometimes even elected to Massachusetts state government. So, it doesn't seem to be a political problem for them, but it's presumably an emotional problem, right? Their children stay with them, or their children often end up in the poorhouse because they have a hard time supporting themselves. So they're apprenticed far, far away from their families. So women might stay. The men might decide that they're going to stay with their new families, right?
So
Which
did
is
you get
pretty much desertion?
I was just going to ask that.
Yes.
So these women had to know what was going to happen, that the soldiers were going to go away at some point, yet they got married anyway.
Right. So the rate of desertion is so much higher in Boston than it is anywhere else. I think it's something like 3% during the 7 Years' War in New England, right? When there are British troops in New England, they lose about 3% of their guys, and that actually includes provincial troops, right? Like, Massachusetts men themselves, for whom desertion's not even that complicated. But in Boston, they lose 10%. Right, which is 3 times as much. It's immense. So so men say they're just not going to go. They stay with their new families, right? Or the other thing that happens is that Boston women decide that they're going to travel with their new husband, right? Wow. And so what we end up with are bits of Boston that I think of as sort of embedded, like splinters, right, into the British Army, so that when the Army comes back, not necessarily, although for some of them, the same regiments, what you really have is something that truly is a civil war, right? Where you actually have people coming back.
Anything else, Bob?
I just want to ask about quartering, because it's one of the big things we always talk about. So you mentioned briefly that they're in rented space. So what's going on with quartering of troops?
So when the troops show up in Boston Harbor, which we see in that other, beautiful engraving of Revere's, that there's not yet clarity, I guess we might say, about where they're going to live, right? So if you're bringing in troops to try to kind of keep order and protect the governor so that he can do what he thinks is his job, he wants them right in front of, like, what we now call the old State House, right? What they then call the townhouse. He's like, I want them right in the middle of Boston where I'm doing my work, where we're going to keep everything calm. But it doesn't totally work out that way. And both his council, but especially the selectmen, understand this, because the law says, right, there is a quartering act and it's renewed regularly by Parliament. And it's very clear. And actually, there's a wonderful, fairly new book by John McCurdy called Quarters, where he lays this all out beautifully. But essentially, the law says that if there are existing barracks, soldiers have to be housed there first. If there are not existing barracks, then they have to be housed in public houses, right? In pubs and bars, whatever. And only after that, if neither of those options are open to them, can they be put into private homes, okay? Well, Boston has actually a really beautifully newly renovated set of barracks right there in Boston Harbor, right? Which we now know as Castle Island. And they had just raised the money just a few years earlier during the 7 Years' War to renovate it for the British Army. At that moment, the Army seemed really happy with it. So they're like, there's a perfectly lovely set of barracks. You can stay out here in the harbor. And the governor and the commanding officer are saying, Castle Island, this is before all the landfill, like, you have to either row 3 miles to get into Long Wharf, or, you can march around through the marsh and it's 7. Like, that is too far, right? And so they argue about this. The governor says, no, there's no way they're staying out there on the island. So initially, the the officers marched the soldiers right up the Long Wharf and quartered them in Faneuil Hall, right on the Boston Common, and this is kind of a standoff, right? They're not putting them in private homes. They want to, but they're not. And the selectmen are really clear. They say, we understand what this law is. And, oh, officers, if you are going to try to put people in private homes, we will have you cashiered. Right. And the governor is really angry. He feels like he's backed up against the wall. And so the compromise they come up with is that the Army will rent spaces, right? They won't requisition them because they can't do that, but they'll rent spaces in Boston in the way that the governor had hoped for.
Wow.
Thank you.
I didn't have this question a moment ago, but all of a sudden it popped in. So these soldiers and the families, they must have created quite a market for the local businessmen because they're camped out on the common. They need all kinds of stuff that the locals can sell them, right?
Yes. Yeah. And Boston is still recovering from the Depression after the 7 Years' War. The economy is not in great shape, although honestly, figuring out how colonial economies work and how to measure them is pretty difficult. So it's hard to say. There's not a ton of poverty either, right? So it's a little mixed. You know, in the beginning, nobody wants to sell to the soldiers, which is like the first 10 days. So they're still eating, you know, rations from the ships. But after that, yes, absolutely. You know, butchers are selling them meat. There is a huge need for firewood. And you know, and then there's all these tavern keepers, right? And taverns are practically part of the town's poor relief efforts, right? They give tavern licenses, right, liquor licenses to people who are in need of some form of support. Right. And so these taverns are actually often run by widows who have nothing else, or men who are in some way incapacitated, often vets. Right. And so they those are the ones who get these licenses. And it's obviously taverns are big hangout places for all these men. Right?
Wow.
So liquor does well.
Well, you are just a tremendous guest. Thank you so much, folks. Professor Serena Zabin of Carleton College, and we've been focusing on the Boston Massacre, as you know, and the book, The Boston Massacre, A Family History. And we also talked a little bit about what we hope is the upcoming video game, Witness to the Revolution. And thank you, Bob, as well, for being my co-host. And thanks to Jonathan Lane, the producer, who reached out and contacted you, I believe. Thank you, Jonathan, for all the work you do. That's it pretty much for this episode of Revolution 250, the Revolution 250 podcast. And thank you again very much. It's great to make your acquaintance.
Thank you for having me on.
Bye, all.